The value of art. I'm Clarissa Levy, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Howard, I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined this morning by Frances Christie, an independent art advisor in the field of modern and post-war British art. Frances, welcome. And I'm so delighted that you're here because there isn't much you don't know about valuing art after your illustrious career, including 20 years at Sotheby's, where you were head of modern British art and deputy chairman. And I won't embarrass you by listing all the other amazing things you have done. But I suppose the reason I'm so excited is because I have always found the subject of valuation quite confusing, as I think lots of people do, because so many values can apply to an object, it seems to me, and it's not as straightforward as you might think. So my first question really is what do we even mean by value?
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for having me on the show. Really thrilled to be here. It is a massive topic, and I'm really thrilled that we're going to dive into it today. I think in simplest terms on art, actually value probably has two different sides to it. I think on the one hand, we often talk about value in terms of not monetary value, but importance, power, the social value of art. And I do spend quite a lot of my time defending the arts. Like, why should the taxpayer give so much money to the arts? And actually, for me, the value of art in that sense is actually relatively easy to defend. And if we don't have the arts, whether they be visual, literary, or the performing arts, we don't capture our expression. And if we don't express ourselves, what's the point? So to me, that sort of is why the value of art in its broadest sense has a huge value that's hard to quantify, but that has an impact on all those who come into it. I think more of our topic today, and we could go on forever about the value of art in that sense, but I think our topic today really, we're looking more to the sort of commercial, the specific value of art in pound symbols. And I think it's one of the reasons why so many column inches are given over to major pictures or sculptures or objects that come up for sale. Whenever there's a record-breaking item, it's splashed across every newspaper across the world. So why is that? I mean, I think it's quite an interesting indicator of what the human psyche is interested in and interested in reading and what appeals. And it is that huge number. Why is someone prepared to pay that much? And I hope that's what we're going to dig deeper into today.
Absolutely. I mean, one thing is clear, that the value of art, in that sense, in the monetary way, has got almost nothing to do with the materials, or at least very rarely, the materials that create it. So the value of the paint and the canvas have nothing to do with the value of the actual finished work of art, often. So how, Frances, do you even begin to approach valuing a painting?
I think in the sort of simplest terms, just to take you back to my day-to-day at Sotheby's for 20 years. I mean, a lot of us as specialists in our areas, we spend a lot of the time valuing art. And I think one of the reasons why one gives an auction estimate, and it's very much called an estimate, is because we can't be absolutely sure. And within that auction estimate, we have a low estimate and a high estimate. So we give a range for a work of art, is because there are so many things that come into play. But I think in simplest terms, it's a bit like when you go and get your house valued, the estate agent comes along and they compare and contrast other similar houses. It's not that simplistic, but in one way, valuing art is a bit like that. It's a lot of comparing and contrasting. We will look at what the last similar artist sold for, what the last similar piece from that date by that artist sold for. And more often than not, there are lots of examples to guide you. But most of the time, actually, we don't have those examples. And so when we don't have those examples, what are the things that we're looking at to guide our thought process, our starting point? And I think comparing, contrasting, like so much of any business really, forms the sort of pillar, I think, on how one might arrive at a value. And I guess the difference with an auction is that ultimately, because people compete against each other, the price, the value, is then all in the eye of the beholder. It's what the highest bidder is willing to pay. And actually, that's why auction can be so satisfying in that sense, because you have a real value that someone put their hand up there and is prepared to pay.
But it's got two variants of an auction. One is it's who the buyers are at the particular time, that particular instance, who are doing it. And then also the effect, presumably, of the competition and possibly how you then, we'll perhaps come on to later, how you then lead into the auction and how you market it. But to very specific factors as to quite what is going on that afternoon, who's prepared to pay that afternoon for it. Yeah.
It's a really interesting point. And actually, I always love to tell the story of the beginning of the art market as we know it. It's a Sotheby's story. So, and I don't work for Sotheby's anymore. So this is not product placement. But Sotheby's had this incredible chairman in the decades after the Second World War. He was a man called Peter Wilson. And at the time, Sotheby's were way behind Christie's. Christie's, they had their strongholds into the big landed families in Britain. So they had a steady supply of great pictures to sell. And Sotheby's were behind. Anyway, Peter Wilson spotted that if we're thinking about value, in order to get as much competition as possible, to drive the prices up as much as possible, you can't just get people in a room. You need to make an event, and you need to make them excited, and you need to create a bit of stardust around it. And he landed the collection of a Jewish banker called Jacob Goldschmidt. And in 1958, he staged the first black tie auction in the world at Sotheby's on the 15th of October, 1958. He got Margot Fonteyn, Somerset Maugham, Kirk Douglas thronging to get into Bond Street, to be there, to be seen and be seen. There were only 7 pictures, and they were by artists like Van Gogh, Renoir, Cézanne, and Manet. So, they were pretty great pieces in their own rights. But by getting everyone together, by making it into this sort of celebrity event, that auction of only 7 pictures, it made a world record total at the time of £781,000. And interestingly, lots of the pictures sold into museums, so showing quite how good they were. They're still there today. His Manet ended up at the Getty, which was quite exciting. But I think it leads us into our discussion on value, is that you can definitely help to create it by making it feel really special.
So if you make an occasion of it, if you make a kind of a production, like a theatre of it, that is going to add to the value. I get that, although it feels little smoke and mirrors. But there must be other elements, though, as well as the sense of occasion and the theatre.
We've almost started backwards. I think the sense that sense of occasion is sort of the cherry on the top once we've established what the elements of value are. And actually, I think that the first element that I'd love to chat about, because it feeds into those pictures that Peter Wilson pulled together, and they're mixed up together. And that's really the element of rarity, which I think is intertwined with quality. And I think you see this play out everywhere. If you can buy something everywhere, well, you don't really want it, do you? Is it that special? It's not special. And I have a great case study on rarity, and it's for a piece that I handled, and that it's by a sculptor called Frank Dobson. He's an early 20th century British artist, not that well known really outside of Britain. Interestingly, he first started carving just before the First World War. And by carving, I mean carving directly into the material itself. So using sort of hammer, chisel straight into stone. And he became a really beautiful carver. It's really hard. You can't make a mistake. If you chisel into a bit of stone and you cut out too much, well, you've kind of got to reform the whole. You can't just stick it back on. And he had this very delicate way of creating almost sort of very fluid outlines in quite hard materials, which I think is a real talent. They felt as if he just washed his hand over them and molded them rather than using a hammer and a chisel. And in worse hands, the sculptures would look sort of wooden and without feeling or movement. Now, the key thing with Dobson, though, is that in the late 1920s, actually no, the early 1930s, he slipped and he fell down Piccadilly. He was apparently chasing a policeman. And because he fell, he then broke his shoulder. And it meant that after 1933, he couldn't really carve again. Therefore, all of his work from the previous decade, when he sort of really came of age as a sculptor, instantly rarer than hen's teeth, because he just didn't carve for the rest of his long career. And a few years ago, I was shown this incredible nude by him. I mean, she was absolutely gorgeous, carved out of sandstone. She was sort of twisting her curves, her form. They were so sort of sensuous and voluptuous. It was a sort of sculpture, you don't need to even see it. I hope you can imagine this wonderful thing that you just wanted to kind of touch and caress. And also, it didn't really matter who the sculptor was by. It was just a beautiful piece of stonework. Anyway, the world record for Dobson at that time was about £377,000, which is quite a lot. But no one had ever really put an estimate in the hundreds of thousands for Dobson because these carvings are so rare. But because this work looked so incredible, we put an estimate, Sotheby's, of 250 to 350,000 to really show everyone that we thought this was the best quality you could get by the artist and the rarest thing by him ever. And I think the estimate in that sense signaled that to everyone. It was reflecting, I was talking about comparing and contrasting in terms of value. It reflected the previous world record, which was 377,000. And our high estimate was in target of that. But we had to have a slightly low estimate to sort of drive as much competition as possible. Now, with all of those things in mind, on the day of the auction, because of its exceptional quality and rarity, given that he didn't carve very much again when he broke his shoulder, that work went on to make £2 million. So that is a huge sum of money. Now, yes, it was absolutely exceptional quality, but getting from 250 to 350,000 to 2 million is a massive leap. And I think part of that, yes, it was two people recognizing the quality and the rarity, but it also goes back to my story about the sense of occasion. This item was placed in a big evening sale of modern and contemporary art where the work was shown to an audience of people much wider than just the British audience, and actually was eventually bought by someone who had never heard of Dobson before the auction.
Wow.
So I think that's quite an interesting lesson in actually straightforward beauty, actually. Beauty, quality, and rarity there. This person was just completely astounded by how good it was, by just on pure aesthetics. And then the sense of excitement and occasion played out. And it's hard to quantify what an occasion can do to value. But in this case, it really helped to drive that competition to £2 million. So that's our first element.
And then there are others, aren't there? Because, well, apart from anything else, a giant sculpture is just not going to fit in my house or even my pocket-sized garden. So what about that? What about size?
Going back to our Dobson sculpture, in terms of size, this carved torso was perfect to have inside. She was about 20 inches high. She could sit on a table. She could sit on a sideboard. She could go anywhere. So in terms of size, that's relatively easy. When it comes to paintings, in a sort of traditional sense, we often talk of mantelpiece pictures, which of a standard size is about 25 by 30 inches. And so many people have a spot. They have that main spot in their living room. And I mean in the most traditional sense. I know not all houses now have a mantelpiece space, but even in a really contemporary style house, you might have a spot, maybe the TV's there, where all the sofas face in and you look at something. So we're going to call that the mantelpiece spot. If you can paint on pictures of that scale, people are always searching for something to focus on where they live. And so you can imagine there's a lot of demand for pictures of that scale. If you get smaller than that scale, people always have space to fit something tinier. There's always a little nook in your downstairs loo or wherever to squeeze something else in. But if we're going massive, we don't all live in New York loft apartments. And this is a really interesting element because, what do they say? Size matters. And I do have a great case study here which shows that actually sometimes bigger is better. And that's a painting by probably the most famous living artist, elderly living artist today, and that's David Hockney. I'm just astounded at how successful he continuously can be. And he's just opened a great show in Paris. People flock to go and see his work. But this case study is of one of his most famous pictures. It's called Portrait of an Artist. And in brackets, it's Pool with Two Figures from 1972. And it's a whopping 84 by 120 inches wide. So it's huge. And the painting has a swimming pool in the foreground. And worth noting that the swimming pool has become a real icon of Hockney's because he left Britain and he first went to LA in the early 60s. And I think discovering that sort of lifestyle of warmth, of being outdoors, of swimming pool culture, I think like totally changed his perspective on the world. And for him, swimming pools are sort of like this icon of freedom in a way, of this bold new world that he hadn't seen before. And so the pool is very much recurs through a lot of his work. And so this great painting is based around a pool. And it's set actually at a friend's house in south of France. And you look over a vista looking into the mountains in the south of France. He's got a friend swimming in the pool, and the friend is swimming towards another pal who is standing at the edge of the pool. So you get this tension between the swimmer and the person standing. What are they doing? Is he looking? Is he about to jump in? Is the swimmer going to come up and talk to him? What is it that's going on between the two of them? And it's this sort of dialogue, this double portrait that Hockney has become quite well known for. I find they're really much more powerful than a single portrait because not only are you looking at two individuals, but you've also got the relationship between those two. Now, this picture came up in 2018 and it had a lot of excitement around it because it's in every textbook there possibly is about David Hockney. And at the time, this is for a living artist, it sold at Sotheby's New York for a phenomenal $90.3 million.
Oh, it's unbelievable, isn't it?
Now, that new size really does matter because in that sense, in other scenarios, the size would be sort of way too big. But I think here as well, it feeds back to our first element. This was a picture of exceptional quality because it ticked all of Hockney's key themes. It was also really rare. He didn't do that many of these 84 by 120 inch items. It had been from museum show to museum show. So it had all of our first elements. And then in this case, it had this ginormous size, which you could argue made it even rarer. So feeding back to our first element. I think it's worth saying at this stage that these elements don't work in silo. The elements, I think, of value are always in conversation with each other.
There are some elements, aren't there, that contribute to the value of an object, which have actually got nothing to do with the object at all, I think. I suppose it's a question, not a kind of assertion. But I'm thinking about who owned the thing before, where it's come from, like its history. I suppose that maybe that is to do with the object. But who owned it before doesn't make it a more beautiful picture. So what about provenance?
I think provenance is really important. You're right, though, it's much less tangible because you can't see it. But I think all of us are drawn in by stories. We love stories. And I think the provenance only adds to the story of a piece. And within the auction world, provenance is everything. You often look through an auction catalogue, and if you can't name the person, you'll see that works are designated things like property of a lady, property of a nobleman. I mean, why would we even put that if people didn't care? It adds to the story of the piece. Where's it been? Who owned it? Where do they have it hanging? And I've got so many case studies on this. And I think probably one of the most interesting case studies, because you do see a sort of tangible effect, is in 2017, we were really privileged to sell the collection of David Bowie, who had died in 2016. And I think there are a few musicians who are so globally known through the generations. He didn't just touch his own generation. It was his incredible avant-garde, his identity shifting, his costumes, his incredible way of pushing the boundaries and everything that he did that still appeals to a really young generation today. And so when we got this collection, actually that was the most amazing thing, is the number of people, but also, as I say, the inter-age of people that came to see it. I think what was surprising for people is that, I mean, everyone assumed that he liked art, but what they didn't realise is that the art that he collected, and he said art was the only thing he ever wanted to own, the art that he collected was modern British art. And he collected modern British art because he said it's what meant the most to him. It's what he empathised with. It's because those artists had walked the same streets that he had. And so he could understand those pictures. And this was a bit of a revelation to the whole world because they assumed he would have collected more international names like, I don't know, Gerhard Richter or Jeff Koons or these much more kind of glamorous contemporary artists. But instead, as I say, he really focused on 20th century British art. And one of the cornerstones of his collection was this incredible portrait by Frank Auerbach. And it was ahead of Auerbach's cousin, Gerda Boehm, painted in 1965. Auerbach was of the generation that came of age after the Second World War, so in the sort of embers of war-torn London. And he had come on Kindertransport from Europe to London just before the Second World War. And he was part of that generation that they lived through the war, so they experienced real angst. And I think his initial paintings, you see that in the palette. They're really quite dark, greys, browns, sludgy, drab colours. His landscapes, he's almost sculpting in paint, but they feel that there's darkness within them. And when he was painting his portraits at this period, it's the same sort of thing. He was almost sculpting his sitters' faces in oil. They are so laden with paint. And for Bowie, this portrait hung at the bottom of his corridor that he passed every day. And actually, it still sends shivers down my spine. He said, "I want to sound like that looks." I mean, what an amazing part of your provenance that David Bowie has said about this picture, that he wants to sound like that looks. So it's no surprise that picture sold for a world record 3.7 million in the 2017 auction.
And that's provenance in a different sense from the way art lawyers tend to think of it in terms of provenance, in terms of legal title or moral title, the restitution issues and so on. It's provenance adds to the interest and value, either perhaps in Bowie's case because he was such a cultural icon himself, or perhaps in some other cases because a collector with a particularly good eye has alighted on that a long time ago, and that itself means people see it as having a greater value.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think there are several things in play here with Bowie. I think in the broadest sense, for Auerbach and modern British art, what Bowie did with his provenance is introduce a lot of people who'd never even heard of these British artists. And that's the power of his name. And we definitely had people bidding in the sale. They never would have picked up a British art catalogue, but because of Bowie, they really wanted to understand the artists that he had bought. Then I think it secondly is going to what you were saying, in that Bowie bought a lot of his British pictures in the 90s, when frankly, no one wanted them. I mean, why weren't we all buying in the 90s? I mean, you could pick all these things up at auction for a song a lot of the time. And I've got so many case studies of things that didn't sell in the 90s and then 10, 20 years later have gone on to make stellar world records. I mean, this Auerbach was one of them. But Bowie also collected Harold Gilman, early 20th century artist, Peter Lanyon, post-war abstract artist. And let's say it is quite difficult to quantify exactly the effect of his provenance. But I do have one picture in the sale where you kind of really see the uplift of his name. His real name, David Bowie's real name was David Jones. And there is a rather obscure but really interesting early 20th century British artist also called David Jones, who was quite spiritual. And we decided that this was quite a funny pun. I mean, a bit obvious, but quite fun. And so we put it as lot one of the auctions. It was a crucifixion in pencil on paper and a bit of ink. So it's not even an oil painting. And we put an estimate of £5,000 to £7,000, which, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, based on comparisons, what previous works on paper like this had made, that was a very fair estimate. In a normal auction, it would have made between that estimate. The morning of the auction that David Bowie sell, this crucifixion by David Jones went on to make a world record, £93,000. It's still the world record for David Jones. I don't think it'll ever get broken, ever, because I think the next price down is in the 20s. So it was so far over and above what the previous market had been. I think that really shows the added value, if you like, that a storied provenance, that a big name can bring.
So when we're looking at what contributes then to the value of a work of art, what have we got? We've got rarity and its quality and beauty. We consider its size and we consider who's owned it before, where it's come from, the provenance. What else, Frances?
Actually, a technical one, which as lawyers you'll like, which actually often people don't even look at. They don't even ask about it. And I always think it's quite similar to a house. Like if you were to buy a house, unless you're one of those very rare people who knows exactly what they're looking at, 99.9% of people have a survey. In fact, I think in some jurisdictions you have to have a survey. And that's essentially checking the condition of the house, what lies beneath. And with an object, it's the same thing. Condition matters. And by condition, I mean, for an oil painting, is the canvas in good shape? Is it stable? Is the paint lifting? Is the paint also stable? Is there cracking? Is it going to all flake off? I mean, these things really matter. And then more than that, if it's been restored, how has it been restored? Was there a whopping hole that we don't know about? Has it essentially therefore had to be repainted? And if it has had to be repainted, well, that has an effect, as you can imagine. And these days, conservation is incredible. I mean, it can be completely invisible. And unless you know what you're looking for, you have no idea that there was even ever a hole. But I think like with a house, you want to know that there's damp lurking beneath, even if you're then prepared to pay whatever price it is. And I think it's the same for objects. And I do have a real case study here for two sculptures, actually. They were both by Henry Moore, who is probably Britain's most well-known internationally 20th century British sculptor. And a bit like Dobson, he also was a devotee of carving in the 1920s. And a number of years ago, there were two carvings on the market from about the same date. One was from 1929 and one was from 1930. So really developmental periods of Moore's life. One was a half figure carved out of Hornton stone, and it was about 14 inches. And it was quite an abstracted figure, but it had a head down to the torso, stopping at her thighs. And then the second sculpture was just a head, and it was in alabaster, and it was a bit smaller at 8 inches. But it was also beautifully carved, very sensuous silhouette of the head. They were both estimated at about the same. The figure was 600,000 to 800,000, and the head was 8 to 1.2 million. So we're within an increment of each other. In an art historical context, both of them really spoke to what Moore was doing at the time. He called it truth to materials. So when you're carving, you carve in line with the material that you're working with, and you want to reveal the qualities of the material. And that's part of the piece, rather than just modelling and casting in bronze, where you don't see any of the source material. So Henry Moore really wanted to bring out, I'd say, the beauty of the stone that he was working in. And in terms of sort of avant-garde representation in an art historical sense, these two sculptures would very much be in the art history textbooks of the pinnacle of his developments in the late 1920s and early 30s. However, on the night of the auction, they were in two different auctions. The half figure didn't sell, but the alabaster head sold for a world record for a unique carving of £5.1 million. So, I mean, that's a huge difference. Obviously, they were slightly different in terms of aesthetics. One was a head, one in alabaster, one was a figure in stone. But they weren't so different that one should make naught and the other make 5 million. And on closer inspection, what was interesting to see is that alabaster is quite a soft stone to remain in perfect condition, but it was perfect. There were no chunks out of it. It had been really looked after. It was a beautiful surface. It was as good as it gets. The stone half figure, however, at some point in its life, the head had been decapitated. So if you looked really, really closely, and actually with the naked eye, you almost wouldn't notice it, there was a very fine line across the neck where it had to be stuck back on. So tiny detail that if you didn't check, you wouldn't have known. But you sort of, clearly people did check and it didn't sell.
And condition meant everything to the sale.
Absolutely everything. It meant that it didn't sell. And so I think that technical side is worth bearing in mind.
So to me, I spend a lot of time thinking about the values of objects for tax purposes. It's always all about tax. And Frances, I've seen examples where the value that is paid for an object at auction absolutely does not represent the value of the object. Let's just be absolutely honest. There was one occasion when there were two brothers who were very competitive with each other and rivals, and they both had been drinking. And you can just guess the rest of the story. They bid for the same object, and each of them was desperate to have it. And they bid, for the sake of argument, a £10,000 work of art. They bid up to 100. And then there was a tax discussion when we had to explain, or try and explain, that £100,000 was not actually the true value of the object, even though that fair is fair. That's what had been paid for it. And so what tax was going to be charged? Was it going to be charged on 10,000 or 100,000? So that for me is a fascinating subject. But just as fascinating is when we see all the time objects which come up at auction, which have all of the elements of rarity, that stardust you talked about, perfect condition, lovely size, everything, provenance, but they don't sell. How does that happen?
So sometimes I think that, but as we said, value is not an exact science. It's quite hard often to gauge the right auction estimate. In my experience, if you've got all of the other elements correct, i.e., as you said, good quality, good condition, good provenance, but it doesn't sell, it's usually because the value was too high. And that's another thing that's worth bearing in mind, is that values have to be set by people. As I say, it's not, you can't just chuck it into an algorithm and it comes out with the exact value. And sometimes people estimate above the weight of the object. It could be that they are so excited by that exceptional quality that they cannot believe that someone else wouldn't pay within the estimate. It could be on pure competition. And actually, this is another discussion. Often, like a house, you'll go to several estate agents. With an object, you might go to a gallerist, you might go to several auction houses. And because they want to sell it, a bit like an estate agent, they will be a bit punchier. They will say, right, I think the estimate is higher. I totally believe we can get a higher price. And sometimes that estimate is too high and there just isn't the demand in the marketplace at that price level. And I think that's another interesting lesson, that's why auction is so interesting, because it's transparent, it's for all to see. People can therefore see that you almost set a new bar if something doesn't sell, because they can see, okay, we need to bring the bar slightly lower for an object of that type.
So if you are too punchy with auction estimates, what that means is that somebody has got to reach the reserve and nobody wants to. But that doesn't mean that the object is worth zero. It just means that there wasn't the bidder on the day.
Absolutely. And also the fact that there isn't a bidder on the day, there can be lots of external reasons for that. And that is also the downside with auction, is that for whatever reason, people might not turn up because they can't, they forgot, they got stuck on a plane or whatever it is, their telephone connection cut out. And that is also a gamble that people take at auction, that on the one hand, it could make millions and millions because you have competition, but on the other, it could make nothing. And to me, that goes back to Peter Wilson's sense of occasion, that is why at auction, it's really important to create that sense of occasion so that people turn up. And then you have one of the fairest marketplaces that there is. You just put up your hand and you can keep putting it up until you get it, until someone else drops out.
I'm very interested in what you say about a fair marketplace, because now we're going to get to the question, which for me is the question of all questions about value, which is, so when I started working in the art world, I assumed that an object just had a value. And I think lots of people do. You know, there is a value for this particular painting. What is it? Well, we ask Frances because Frances will know, but there is a value. And that turned out to be quite naive, because there are, in fact, many, many values which can all absolutely properly and correctly apply to the same object, but just for different purposes. And this flummoxed me as it flummoxes many people. And I wonder if you can tell me a bit about how it is that different values can apply to the same object correctly.
I think, as we've just been chatting, valuing is not an exact science, which is why in the auction world we have auction estimates. And that's the first type of value. So in simplest terms, an auction estimate has a low estimate and a high estimate. It's a range. It's what we think the bidding might be somewhere in between. But it also has a strategy. When you're setting auction estimates, that low estimate is really important. If it's set too high, you scare people away. If you set it too low, people don't think the thing is important enough. So you need to find a balance with that low estimate. It needs to be set at the level at which it sort of enhances by its element of significance, but it also entices by its element of affordability.
So it doesn't have, so the auction estimates aren't necessarily the range within which you think an object's going to sell, actually.
Exactly. The low estimate needs to attract people to the bidding. whereas the high estimate is where you hope that that will guide them. So it still is the range, because if there's only one bidder, then they've been attracted and they'll bid at the low estimate and they could get at the low estimate. But then when you get multiple bidders, hopefully it hits the high estimate, and hopefully it hits even higher than the high estimate if the bidding is really good. But it's a range of where you might think the bidding will end. We then have, out of those auction estimates, something that we call the fair market value. And this goes back to your tax question. If you are to pay tax on things, you need one figure. And what is a fair figure to pay? As you say, if your two guys got so drunk that they shooted it up to 100,000, it's not really worth 100,000. But then again, they did bid, so maybe it's not really worth the low estimate either. You need to come to a fair idea. And interestingly, the fair market value over the years that I was at Sotheby's changed where we pitched it. But today, as a general rule of thumb, the fair market value, the level at which you take tax, probate in particular, is set at the mid-auction estimate. And I suppose because that's your average. Some items will go below, some items will go to the top estimate. And so it feels fair that your fair market value is set at the middle. So we've got three values so far. We've got the low estimate, the high estimate, the fair market value. The next value, which we do a lot of, is the insurance estimate. Now, with insurance, you've got several other things at play, because insurance, in simplest terms, is replacement value. If your picture was to burn in a fire, how much money do you need to go out and buy it to replace it? And this is a bit tricky with unique objects, because the fact of the matter is you can't just go out and buy it. But if you were to try and get something similar, you might not just be able to buy it at auction. You need to go to a dealer, into a retail environment. And as a general rule of thumb, in a retail environment, like all retail, they've got overheads, they've got marketing, they've got shop staff, they've got all these sorts of things. They have big overheads. And so there is definitely a premium added on top of the inherent value of something to put it into that retail environment. And so as a general rule of thumb, for an insurance estimate, insurance value, an auctioneer would say it would be double the low auction estimate. But it's not as simple as that, because people like to insure things at different levels. Sometimes people, especially if they've got really special things, one might think that actually double the low auction estimate is not enough. So they might insure it. They might add the low estimate and the high estimate. You get a really solid insurance estimate. And then there are some people, because the quality of their work is so strong, that they might triple the low estimate. I mean, that is a really high insurance estimate, and your premiums are going to be huge. But it goes back, Clarissa, to your question. There are lots of values of things. And it goes back to the point that actually you need to know the purpose of your value when we're talking about value.
It happens to me all the time that people will come, they want to discuss an object, they want to do maybe some estate planning, and they've got some works of art, so they bring a valuation. And that's always the question, like, first of all, when was this valuation prepared? Secondly, sort of who by? And thirdly, what for? Because it makes a massive difference if it was done 10 years ago for insurance. That's just absolutely not going to be appropriate for today's tax purposes.
I think insurance values of all the values is the most misleading. And I've had countless experiences where people only remember the highest number.
Yeah.
We're all the same. You get excited because you hear the high number. And insurance estimates, by their very nature, have to be high because they've got to be in a retail context. And they've latched on to their insurance values. And so that's all they can think about, that this has been insured at £500,000, so it must be worth £500,000. But going back to what I was saying about how we work out that retail replacement in an auction context, a £500,000 object is actually a low estimate of 250,000. So that means an auction estimate of 250 to 350,000. And at 250,000, if there's no competition and you put that at auction, that could sell at 250,000 or whatever the reserve is. So that's half what that premium insurance value was. That can often be a very difficult conversation.
Yeah, as often as not. Sometimes people will come with an object which they don't know what it is, and it's a complete surprise and delight to discover that it's a rare and beautiful object that is worth a great deal of money. But actually, more often than not, it is a little bit disappointing because, as you say, people have latched on to the insurance figure. That's what they think their object is worth, and you have to break it to them that there's no way it's going to sell for that. And I mean, I can think of many instances where different values apply, all kinds of technical valuations which can apply to the same object. But without going into any of that, I think what most catches people's attention are things like, as you say, the Stardust events, the theatre. And what particularly strikes me, since we've got you here, Frances, what I want to ask you is, how is it that the Banksy picture, Girl with a Balloon, which was worth £1 million in 2008, and I think probably many of us will be familiar with this image of the girl with the balloon, it's a very famous Banksy picture, suddenly was worth 18.5. So it went from 1 million to 18.5 million in 10 years. What happened and how?
So Banksy is really clever. I think people often sort of, dismiss him as just a joker. And yes, he's good at sort of graffitiing everywhere and they're really humorous. But I think his popularity sometimes masks quite how sophisticated an artist or a person, a mind, he really is. He is incredibly clever and he knows the market inside out and he has played it very, very well. Girl with the Balloon is probably one of his most famous images. It's literally a girl and she's holding a balloon that's in the shape of a heart. And this came to auction and it was in a very heavy frame. And sort of, I remember it had this piece of paper on the back and they might not know, all works by Banksy. He has a company, his office is called Pest Control, which is brilliant in itself. And all Banksys have to be authenticated by Pest Control. And there was an officious note on the back of this painting that said, do not unframe under any circumstances. And when the specialists in the contemporary department checked with Pest Control, because they check everything with Pest Control, you have to check Pest Control. Pest Control said, yeah, that's right. Do not take it out of its frame. Do not touch the frame. The whole thing is part of the picture. You must keep it all together. And so here it goes. It's the last lot of the auction. It comes up. The auctioneer's getting the bidding going. Boom. All very exciting. It sells for £1 million. Everyone's thrilled. At the point that the hammer went down, and it's captured on YouTube, go and watch it now if you've forgotten about it, someone presses a button in the audience. It must be by remote control. And slowly, that picture starts moving through the frame and shredding. And there are some incredible photos, I was not there, but of people behind the phone banks, and they are all looking just like in amazement as this piece that's just made £1 million is self-shredding through the frame. But then, in a twist of luck almost, the shredder jams. I don't know, I actually still don't know whether Banksy intended this. I don't think he did, actually. The shredder jammed, and it meant that half the picture was shred and the other half was held within the picture still. I mean, can you imagine the conversations that happened behind the scenes after this? Luckily, it was the last lot. The auctioneer did very well. Oh, exciting. Okay, bye. See everyone. Bye. To wrap it up.
Talk about drama.
Huge drama. I mean, the conversations after must have been like, what on earth do we do? But because it's Banksy, I think very quickly people thought, well, this can't be an accident. And with great foresight, the person who paid £1 million, they could have completely reneged on it because the state of the art, the piece was not as it was at the beginning of the auction. But they actually could see that this was master organised by Banksy to keep it. And after the auction, quite quickly afterwards, the picture was out on display for everyone to see. Banksy had renamed it Love is in the Bin. The YouTube video went absolutely viral. I think there were 30,000 news stories within 3 hours. I mean, it was bonkers. So, masterwork, as I say, for Banksy. If people didn't know who he was, they did now. And they all knew about this picture. And so you asked how you get from £1 million to when this picture came up again to be sold in 2021, changed from Girl with the Balloon to Love is in the Bin for £18.5 million. And I think, there's so many things here, but going back to what we've just been talking about, Banksy, in a single moment of that auction, he created exceptional rarity. There is no other painting that is half shredded and that essentially as a work was created during a live auction when it had just made £1 million. There's no other one. So it's about as unique as they come. He just added amazing provenance, like the incredible provenance of this auction, of being in a live case scenario. And actually, we haven't talked about, because I think provenance, you can take it even further, where things have real historical importance. And one could argue that in an art historical context, even in a market context, this is the only painting ever to have self-destructed. And in creating a viral news story, goes back to what Peter Wilson had created at Sotheby's with the Goldsmith sale. He created the most incredible sense of occasion around the creation of this new object as love is in the bin. And so when it came to auction a few years later to sell, it was all lined up for people to relish that story again. I mean, is that worth 17? Because he added a value of 17.5 million. I mean, always hard to quantify. But it is just interesting, the elements that he layered on top of that initial picture to get to 18.5 million.
It's something that art lecturers will be telling their students to look at in 50 years' time or 100 years' time. But just one question. If the intention was to shred the whole thing so it ends up in the bin, it only goes half the way. If it's a design accident like that, still art? The half-shredded image?
I think it is, because what the artist intended. It always goes back, we talk about agency everywhere. That is what the artist intended.
But what if it wasn't? Can it be art if it's not on purpose? If it was an accident?
I think, so many major elements of creation are accidents. I think if you don't have accidents, you don't have innovations. And sometimes those accidents create those new innovations and those new pieces of art. So I think accidents are absolutely can be part of it.
Perfect. And I certainly didn't mean to deviate from the massive question of valuation into what is art. Let's just not even go there. But actually, here is a question, a last question probably, which does cover both topics, what is art and what is value. The banana duct taped to the wall, Frances. Can you explain?
I actually think this is cut from the same cloth as the Banksy. I mean, it goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, the value of the actual materials. How much is a banana these days? 99p? I don't know. I don't think I've ever bought a single banana, but it should be under £1 because it can't be worth more than £1. But I think it's like this idea of the creation of a new artwork that Banksy managed to drum up. And it goes back to Peter Wilson's tenet that it's a sense, an event can add value. And in the case of Maurizio Cattelan, I mean, people, just as a word on him, and people remember that I think he's the artist that in Charles Saatchi's exhibition, his piece was the dead Pope lying on the floor. I think it'd been the Pope hit by an asteroid. I think that's the same artist. So he is sensationalist. This is exactly what Saatchi alighted on with those young British artists. I mean, Cattelan's not British, but it's that real sense of just shock. And I think that's what feeds in with this banana. It's sort of shock that could this even be a piece of art? It's shock that it should have any value. But in the same way that people look at Damien Hirst's spots and they're like, oh, well, I could have done that. Yeah, well, they didn't. They didn't. And they didn't duct tape the banana to the wall. And in people's both sort of disgust at that, you can't also help be seduced by the craziness of it and what he's doing and what he's even trying to say. And clearly people really were seduced because someone paid $6.2 million for the banana stuck to the wall. Or they didn't even pay for the banana because famously the person who bought it then unpeeled it and ate it. But that then adds to its story, the story, the concept of it. And we're talking about it now. So it's going to create debate for years to come.
So it wasn't the banana that was worth 5 million quid. It was the story and I don't know.
The idea.
The idea?
The idea.
The idea. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm not sure that I am ever going to completely understand the value of art, Frances, but this has been an absolutely brilliant introduction and an explanation of many of the things that go towards how we value art. And I'm so grateful to you for joining us. I've got another 1,000 questions for next time. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.